Today, we are diving deep into that conceptual hurdle that I think almost every single developer faces at some
Well,
point.
absolutely. That big transition.
Right, the transition to object-oriented programming, OOP. I mean, if you spent time writing procedural code,
Yeah.
just normal code, functions doing things, and then you suddenly hit this wall of new terms,
hmm
classes, objects, attributes, methods, inheritance, overriding, it can feel like someone just handed you a single, really intimidating sentence of pure jargon.
It's a lot to take in at once because it's not just syntax.
Exactly. It's a completely new way to organize your thought process. So our goal for this deep dive is to turn that intimidating list into a final, crisp revision checklist. We're going to demystify these core concepts.
We'll be using Python for the examples mostly, but these ideas are central.
Oh, for sure. This structure, these 6 fundamental building blocks, is universal to pretty much every modern language, whether you're working in Java, C#, C++, R. The mission is to give you the mental framework, the why behind the structure, so that when you write your next class, you're not just, typing definitions, you're actually engineering robust code. Okay, let's unpack this.
Right. To really anchor these concepts, let's start with, well, it's a classic analogy for a reason. Let's talk about a manufacturing company.
A car factory.
Car factory, exactly. It really grounds the relationship between the first two critical terms, class and object. So if you imagine that car factory, the most foundational concept is the class.
Okay.
The class is the template. It's the specification, the blueprint for, say, a new model of car.
So it contains all the definitions.
All the definitions. It must have 4 wheels. It must have a 2.0-liter engine. It must have seating for 5 people. It's the plan.
So the class is the potential, the definition. It sets the rules. It's the static data about what something can be.
Precisely. Now, here's where the distinction becomes really crucial for programmers. If you look at that blueprint, well, you can't drive it.
Right. It's just ink on paper.
It's just ink on paper.
Hmm.
The blueprint itself is, frankly, useless until it produces an object. The object is the concrete instance built from that blueprint. So each car that rolls off the assembly line, that red one, that blue one, the one with the deluxe trim, they are all individual objects of that one car class.
I think that's the moment the light bulb clicks for a lot of people. The object is the real, the functioning thing.
Absolutely. Objects are what are useful. The class is just the factory that makes them useful.
And if you connect this idea to the real world, you start to realize that everything you work with in code is an object. The user logging into your website, the specific transaction they just
The
made.
tat napping on your desk or the specific laptop we're recording on right now.
Exactly.
And that realization leads directly to the next level of abstraction. Because if every useful thing is an object, then every object we encounter in life or in code can be defined by 2 essential elements.
Its features and its action.
Its features and its actions. And OOP gives us the mechanism to bind those 2 things together cleanly.
Okay, so let's define those 2 elements using the terminology we need for our revision checklist. The first element is the identifying information, the characteristics. In OOP, these are the attributes.
Right. They are the data points that differentiate one object from another, even if they come from the same blueprint.
So using your laptop example, the attributes are its specific color, its unique serial number, its current battery life.
The specific version of its operating system, all these static bits of data that are stored on the object itself.
And the second element is what that object does, the behaviors, the tasks, the functions. In OOP, we call these methods.
Methods are how the object interacts with the world or, changes its own internal state.
Yeah.
For that laptop object, the methods might be things like run diagnostic test or connect to Wi-Fi
Shut down.
or shut down.
Yeah. I think it's important to clarify terminology here, especially for our checklist. We often use the word function, and methods look just like functions in Python code.
They do, but the context here matters immensely. In object-oriented programming, we reserve the term method for a function that is explicitly defined inside a class structure. It belongs to that class.
So tied to it.
It's tied to it. And this binding, where the data, the attributes, and the actions, the methods, are packaged together, that's what makes OOP so powerful as an organizational tool.
That makes perfect sense. It's like saying my human object has attributes like height and hair color, and methods like eat and run. The data and the behavior are locked together.
Exactly. And that concept is called encapsulation, the idea of bundling the data with the methods that operate on that data. It simplifies things so much because if something goes wrong with, say, a dog object, you know exactly where to look.
Inside the dog class.
Inside the dog class.
Okay, let's move from the theoretical and into some actual code structure using that classic dog class example from our sources. So we define class dog, and then inside it we define a simple method, bark. If we create an object, buddy dog, and we call buddy.bark, it prints woof. Simple enough.
So far, so good.
But here's the piece that stops beginner's goal. The mysterious self parameter.
Ah, self. I remember thinking that self was just, I don't know, syntactic noise when I first learned this.
It looks like clutter, doesn't it? It appears as the very first argument in every method definition, def bark, self.
Yeah.
But when you call the method buddy.bark,
Yeah.
you never actually pass it in. So why is it there?
That self parameter is, well, it's the object's identity card. It is absolutely crucial for object independence.
Okay.
When you call buddy.bark, what Python is actually doing behind the scenes is it's passing the buddy object itself as that first argument. It's basically saying, hey, bark method, this specific instance called buddy is the one calling you.
Ah, so it's implicit.
It's implicit. And think about it. If you have buddy dog and also Tom dog, right, two separate objects, when you call buddy.bark, self points to buddy's data. When you call tom.bark, self points to Tom's data.
So without self, the bark method wouldn't know which dog's name, for example, it was supposed to be working with.
It would have no idea. Self ensures that Buddy and Tom can be built from the same blueprint but maintain completely independent lives and behaviors based on their own unique attributes.
It's the key to letting the method access the data specific to the object that's calling it.
Precisely. It's the mandatory key to accessing the object's internal state.
That leads us directly to the next crucial implementation concept then, the constructor. This is how the object gets its initial internal state in the first place.
Right.
So we want Buddy to have a name right when he's created. This is handled by a special method called the constructor, which in Python we define using init, the two underscores on each side.
The core thing to remember about the constructor is that it runs automatically. You don't call it. It's triggered the instant you create the object.
It's the manufacturing process starting immediately.
Yeah, exactly.
So if we look at our personalized dog example, we stop writing just Buddy dog. Instead, we write Buddy dog Buddy. We're pushing the name right into the creation process.
And inside that init method, you see the magic line, self.name equals name. This is the mechanism that takes that incoming parameter, the string, buddy, and stores it as a permanent attribute, self.name, onto that specific object instance.
So when I create Buddy, the constructor runs, it accepts Buddy as an argument and assigns it to the name attribute of the self object. Which means if I redefine my bark method to print self.name plus list says woof, the object knows exactly who it is.
Because self remembers the attribute that init set for it.
That's the perfect loop.
It is. The constructor sets the data, self holds the reference to that data, and the methods use that data to perform personalized actions.
Okay, so we've covered the four basic concepts: class, object, attribute, method, and the two required implementation tools, self and init. Now we get to the concepts that make OOP a massive time saver.
This is for real-world projects, right? Code reuse and specialization. We're talking inheritance and overwriting.
This is where the whole structural advantage of OOP really starts to shine.
It really does. So inheritance is defined simply as making the attributes and methods of one class, we call it the parent or superclass, automatically available to other classes, the child or subclasses.
So if I have a really complex set of behaviors defined in Class A, Class B can get, say, 95% of those behaviors just by declaring it inherits from A.
That saves an incredible amount of typing.
It's not just about saving typing, though, is it? It's about establishing a consistent contract.
That's a great way to put it. Think about our animal hierarchy example. We define a generic class animal, and we say it has a fundamental requirement. Every animal must have a way to speak. So we give it a default speak method that prints some generic animal sound.
Then we define class dog, and we declare it inherits from animal using that parenthesis notation, class dog animal.
Right. And now, if we create a dog object, D, and call DSpeak, even though we haven't written a speak method inside the dog class at all,
It still works.
it still works. It successfully executes the generic speak method from the parent animal class. And if you remove that inheritance, the call instantly produces an attribute error.
That error is the proof, isn't it? It proves the capability was inherited, not redefined. That's huge for setting a baseline for an entire family of objects.
It creates a foundational guarantee. But that leads us to the next, more nuanced question. If inheritance gives us the speak method for free, why would we ever bother writing another speak method inside the dog class? Why reinvent the wheel?
Because the generic sound isn't specific enough. I mean, the generic method works, but a dog doesn't make a generic animal sound.
It makes a woof.
It makes a woof, right?
Exactly. And that need for specialization, while still adhering to the parent structure, that brings us to our last big concept, method overriding. Overriding is when the child class defines a method with the exact same name as an inherited method. It's literally replacing the generic behavior with customized behavior.
So the animal class defined the rule. You must have a speak method. The dog class follows that rule, but it says, okay, but my specific implementation of speak is woof.
And the cat class, which also inherits from animal, says, and my specific implementation is meow.
This is a critical insight for advanced OOP design, I think. The parent class defines the structure, the what.
And the child class uses overriding to define the specialized behavior, the how.
What's really fascinating here is how maintainable this makes the code. If we later decide that all animals should also have a move method, we just have to define it once.
You define it once in the animal parent class, and every single dog, cat, and bird object instantly inherits that new capability.
And if the dog needs a specialized run method because it moves differently than a generic animal, it just overrides the parent's run method.
Keeping the structure intact while specializing the function. This is exactly how complexity is managed in large applications. You change one blueprint feature, and it propagates across the entire system instantly.
Amazing.
And with that, we've basically covered the entire foundation of object-oriented programming. So for your final conceptual revision, let's just run through that checklist.
Let's do it.
Okay, OOP is fundamentally about encapsulation and structure. The class is the template, the abstract blueprint.
The object is the useful, concrete instance built from that blueprint, the real thing.
The attributes are the data, the specific features or characteristics stored inside the object.
The methods are the actions, the behaviors the object can perform, operating on its own internal data.
Then you have inheritance, which gives you massive code reuse, establishing a shared structure by transferring features from a parent to a child.
And finally, overriding provides that necessary specialization, letting the child customize a parent's behavior to fit its own unique needs.
That's it, the whole framework.
So what does this all mean in practice? These 6 concepts, plus the tools like self and init, they're the language you use to model real-world processes in code. Adopting OOP isn't about learning a few new keywords.
No, it's about adopting a new organizational paradigm.
Yeah, where data and actions are logically grouped together, making your projects more scalable, more testable, and just far, far easier to maintain in the long run. All right, for your final thought to mull over, think about an app you use every day, maybe a streaming service like Netflix. What would its main blueprints be?
Ooh, good one.
Probably a class movie, a class user. And crucially, what specific attributes would the init constructor need to set immediately for a movie object to make sure it's recognizable and usable? Things like its title, its runtime, or maybe its genre list. Start seeing the world as objects, and OP will become second nature.